Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Open Wound Research Podcast. This is Winnie Tuniswa, CEO of Open Wound Research. And today I am honored to welcome Mr. Sean Agnew to the podcast. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That's brilliant. So, just for the audience, we'll do our usual introduction. I think Sean is a great change of pace. We have a lot of clinicians on the podcast, a lot of clinical researchers on the podcast, and Sean really brings, I think, a unique perspective to wound care. By way of introduction, Sean is currently the Chief Growth Officer at Iovocare. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. And prior to that, he worked at Kraft Health and has other experiences that I think we'll go into in the podcast. He's a growth strategist, an executive advisor. He does a lot of keynote speaking. We've spoken together at many conferences, and he, as the audience will discover, has a wonderful radio voice. He brings more than 25 years of experience driving business growth, revenue, and organizational transformation. And I think what's unique about what he brings today is his view on AI within the wound care space. Uh, Sean is also a U.S. Army veteran. And thanks for serving, Sean. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that as well. And he received his education at the University of Mannheim in Germany. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So, Sean, welcome again.
Thank you.
So, no one comes to wound care. No one graduates high school and says, "I want to end up in wound care." Right? That just is not a thing. So, what we've seen from a little bit of your history is that you were in the military, you were educated abroad, and in your career, you've done many different things. Could you give us like an idea of how you ended up in wound care and how your previous experiences shape how you've participated within the field?
Yeah. The interesting thing is it's such a nonlinear line of how wound care came to be in my universe and I came to be in its. So, as you mentioned, over the years, I've worked with a lot of organizations. I was with a company that went from a startup to being a $3.6 billion buyout from Computer Associates in the 90s. From there, went on to work with some of the world's largest hospitality companies. And so I was going along doing well, and everything was all good. And uh, one day, I had started to get a little bit of a cough, and I'm very much the typical male where I just don't go to the doctor. I'm okay saying that on record. And my wife is the exact opposite. So I had a slight cough for a couple of weeks, and didn't think anything of it. And then one day I got a phone call from a triage nurse, and she said my wife had called her and told me I wouldn't come into the doctor. And I said, "Oh, great." So she asked me a couple of questions, and after I answered those questions, she, in the most even kill voice you've ever heard of another human being, said, "Okay, so either you get somebody to come and drive you to the nearest ER, or I'm going to call a police car to come pick you up and take you immediately." And I mean, being in our current climate in this country, I am not prone to having a police car coming to get me for anything. So my wife came and picked me up. We went, did some tests. Coming to find out, I was having heart failure, and looked up, and 3 hours later, I had my lungs were punctured. They drew out 5 liters of fluid out of my lungs. They were surprised I was able to breathe. Uh, Talking about pacemakers and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so my mother had been in healthcare for 20 some odd years, running a hospital in North Carolina. And she had talked to me many times about instances like this, but it really kind of hit home to me that me having no symptoms, right, was very problematic. And if that could have happened to me, that could happen to anybody else. So I started researching companies that were doing preventative scanning for people. Come to find out, someone I had trained as a sales executive went to work for one of these companies, and that person happened to reach out to me in that same period. After meeting with him and the CEO, they had this great vision of opening up centers to be able to help people get preventative scans, whether it's CT, MRI, whatever the case may be, across the country. And so I dialed into that, and started to help them to open clinics across the country. I helped open clinics in Nashville and Orlando and Charlotte and Phoenix, all over the country. And so that really dialed me into healthcare. I got to meet a lot of wonderful practitioners, clinicians who said, hey, we have these things we'd like to offer, but our system has some issues, and we'd like to know what your thoughts are. That led to a meeting with a CEO who had worked with Sir Richard Branson with his medical company. And he was talking about his vision for iUvoCare and wanting to work internationally and bring products and services that weren't being readily available because of various issues from the administration here in the US, but they were being used across the world. And I thought that was amazing. That was I knew from my own experience, I knew from my mother's experience, all those things were very true. And that started me on that path. That in turn led me into wound care, because I got to meet some practitioners who had great products that wound care could help. And in my own family, my own uncle had his from his knee down got amputated because he did not have proper wound care. So I had a lot of personal experience, and because of that, just ended up starting to make relationships, business and personal, with a lot of folks in the wound care space. And that's kind of how I ended up landing in the wound care world.
It's funny how that works, right? Like you have an experience and it takes you on a path that you had not anticipated.
Absolutely. No, would have never thought. Couldn't have written it if I wanted to. So, yeah.
Well, tell me which part of North Carolina. You mentioned that your family's from North Carolina, or you lived in North Carolina.
My mother, I'm not from there, but she's lived in Kill Devil Hills for, gosh, probably 20 years now. She's a stone's throw away from the ocean. So she ran a hospital there in Kill Devil Hills, which was the only hospital for all those little islands for the longest time. So she got to see a lot of instances where, some of the challenges that rural hospitals will have, she had to experience, because even though they were supporting a very large community, many times their resources just, weren't what they probably should have been or could have been. So that was another driver when the opportunity with iUvoCare came up.
Okay, that's perfect. I live on the other side of the state, so
Mm.
I live in Charlotte.
Oh yeah,
So
that's where I opened the clinic.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, yeah.
there's always a North Carolina connection. It's very odd, until I moved
Yes.
down here. I'm like, there's always an odd North Carolina connection. So if we now know how you got into wound care. If we could take a step back, you were in the military for how many years, and kind of were you exposed to wounds in that part of your career?
Yeah, I was so originally when I went in the military, it was a very selfish reason. I had a scholarship for athletics, and had a knee injury, and no one told me that once you get hurt, people stop paying for things. So I went into the military expecting to be in for 2 years just to pay for my education, and then as I was in, Desert Shield, Desert Storm popped off. Was already brewing on the horizon, and popped off. But I ended up being in a total of almost 6 years. And so I wasn't in healthcare at all. I was a communications expert. So I had a NATO top secret security clearance. So my unit was the unit that did all the communications between all the NATO units, and then Saudi Arabia, and then the Pentagon. So it was a very interesting time, and I had very little to do with healthcare at that point. Like I said, my mother had been telling me for years to get into healthcare, and I just said, it just didn't think it was something I relished, because quite frankly, I'm squeamish with blood. So odd that I speak it and talk to wound care practitioners, and I'm in clinics all the time. But yeah, it was something that was far removed from where I ended up.
That's interesting. And so you were there for 6 years. And I apologize for looking down because I'm taking notes. Find this all fascinating. You were in for 6 years, but you mentioned athletics. What sport were you
I
participating in?
played I played football and basketball.
Okay, what position in football?
So football, I was a tight end. I was the slowest tight end you'll ever see, but I had great hands. So if you threw the ball to me and there were six guys around, I was coming down with that ball, but I was getting you not one extra yard. So yeah, which is funny because my oldest son was incredibly fast. So I don't know where he got that from, but he didn't get it from me.
Okay, that's funny. So you would on the West Coast offense, you would run the sit.
Yes, yes. I was great at blocking. I was great at pulling, and I was great at catching in the middle. So, but beyond that, I was getting you no yardage. Yeah.
That's brilliant. And so you attend the University of Mannheim. We talked a little bit earlier. You learned German, etc. You come back and you go through your career. You have this health event, and you find yourself in wound care and where you are today. Uh, I think what's really interesting about what you do and my exposure to you has been in and around AI, right? And I think there's so much, so many ideas around AI about the potential, but I think where I'm really excited about today's conversation is really getting down to okay, what's the promise of AI? What's the reality of AI? How should people in wound care think about AI, right? And then the usual, me, we did have one presentation together. Uh, what are the dangers? It's not a free ride. And so, if you could, real quick, like, how have you interacted with AI? What have you done? What is your specialization within the area of AI in wound care?
Yeah. So it's been interesting with starting in communications with the military, and this will definitely date me. So when I was in the military, I had to go through specialty school for a number of different technologies. So you had radar, you had satellites, you had the old mainframes with the mag tapes. I remember having to load those heavy mag tapes up every few hours because they would only run so fast. And then over the years, as I was in software and other things, seeing those iterations change, right? And the interesting thing to me about that is I'm a history buff by nature. So the wonderful thing about history is it has so much to teach us about the present and the future if we just look at it and study it and learn it factually, right? And when I say factually is so many things that people have been passed on or taught have been revised or rewritten from other people, so they weren't factual. And so with AI, what I think is some of the most amazing promises of AI is it gives you such a dearth of information. The challenge though is sorting that information and authenticating that information, right? The wonderful thing about the internet is that there's anybody can participate. The most dangerous thing about the internet is anybody can participate. So AI is just putting fuel on that fire. And so with healthcare in particular and with wound care, the wonderful things there is traditionally, especially when we look at certain ethnic groups, right? People who have more melanin in their skin tone have traditionally the data has not been accurately portrayed and listed historically, or it's been deleted totally. So in many cases, when we're using those predictive measures, which AI is a predictive algorithm, it's a predictive tool, um, you're not getting accurate information. So to me, those are some of the things that up front have to be known. And as we talk about having workflow systems where AI can aggregate a lot of things, but you still need a human in the loop. You still need authenticity. But the reality is you're still going to have comparisons of different data sets and different data sources to be able to come out with an actual accurate bit of information for it to do its best work. And I think if people don't think like that up front, it's incredibly problematic. I mean, we just saw what, 3 weeks ago, the first lawsuit from for 2 lawyers who used briefs that were done by AI, and AI made up the cases that they were reciting, and the judge found that out and said, "Wait, these aren't cases. These are not actually real cases." And so I'm sure some of that's already been occurring over the last 12 to 36 months that no one knows and has not been caught. And if we don't think that that's has occurred or been occurring or will occur in healthcare or wound care, I think we're living with blinders on.
No, absolutely. So maybe we should take a step back because I think our audience is primarily clinicians and non-technical people, vis-a-vis technology or AI. So can you give a taxonomy of AI in terms of the models? Because I think one of the talks we had, we talked about SLMs versus traditional LLMs. What is open weight versus the cutting edge foundational models? And in your work, where you're really taking AI and putting it into real workflows, what is the application of a traditional frontier model versus a small language model? And what are the opportunities and threats of open weight models versus proprietary models?
Yeah, I mean, with what we do, in many cases, we're working with hospitals. We're working with, we have partners that do specific app specialties that they're building things to take a certain amount of information and then have a specific outcome, right? And then in other cases, we're working with the whole enterprise where they're wanting to, it's multimodal. So they're having, instead of, everybody right now is ambient usage has gone up, almost 65% in 12 months, as more and more practitioners and clinicians are using ambient software. But we're just now starting to look at multimodal models where they're getting other things. They're getting x-rays, they're getting labs, they're getting other things in that process. So with what we do is we will help with those strategies and sometimes with those implementations of building those systems. The challenge for many of those things, and we have to mention the what I call the cautionary phrase is HIPAA. Everybody loses their mind when you start talking about putting systems together because HIPAA comes into play. But if we remember, because I remember back in the days, I was with a company called Parson Consulting, who was actually working on some of the legislation for HIPAA when it came about, and Sarbanes-Oxley on those two acts. And they're very specific, and we've now used them for threat on everything. Because if I'm not sharing any of the specific identifiable information, I am not in violation of HIPAA. So there's many ways to have some of that data to be shared, right? So as you and I talked about, and you mentioned a minute ago, if it's an LLM situation where it's open and virtually anybody has access to it to some extent, versus it being a small language model that's enclosed and it's not accessible, or you can have something where it is password protected, or there is some sort of firewall or encryption built into it. Those are great tools to be used. But once again, the challenge gets to be is when we talk about the separation of, at least for me, when I talk to clinicians, we have to separate what we're doing, the clinician's doing for the patient, and what we're talking about when it comes to billing, because that seems to be that separation gap, right? I remember in school, we used to have those classrooms where you had that little folding thing that came out where you could separate the classrooms, or you could open it up and everybody be in the same classroom. To me, that's where we are, is figuring out what is that folding door when we look at the clinician operating system versus the clinician paywall, right? Because obviously that's when you have HIPAA issues that are going to be coming, because you have to tie that information to be able to get paid, to get reimbursement, to get all the other things that clinicians have to have. So with us, that's where we work in that space. There's a lot of interesting work out there that's being done by various companies. And I know this I can't imagine this surprise to anybody that's watching this or listening to this, but big tech has been planning to come for healthcare for years. And they are now making the move. So everybody, I don't care if it's OpenAI, I don't care, they are making the move to come after healthcare. The challenge they're going to have, though, which is the same challenge that we saw real world with the announcement from Ford that they had, where Ford got rid of 75% of their engineers in lieu of AI doing the design work. And then they had to bring the engineers back and bring them back on staff because AI didn't have the nuance and the inference that it needed, even though it had the data, right? And so many of the technology companies are starting to find some of those issues, as we've seen. Recently, you had Chat ended up failing their testing for medical testing, even though they have all the data. So when you talk about the differences of those systems of open weight, open source, all those other things, to me, when I look at it, is I'm looking at what are the questions we're wanting to ask, and then who is going to verify those questions, right? Because that tends to be the most problematic thing that I see in the conversations. Because half the time when I talk to, whether it's medical or not, when I talk to an owner of a clinic, a business, or whatever, one of my first questions to them is, what's your data capture plan? And 85% of them look at me wide-eyed and go, what is that? Or I don't have one. And I'm like, well, the most valuable thing you're going to have in the next 50 years is going to be your data, right? I don't care if that's your messaging. I don't care if that's your email. I don't care if that's your texting. I don't care if that's your SOP manuals. I don't care if that's your ambient conversations. That's all your proprietary data. So if you're not capturing it, you're either wasting it, and now you have to go back and reinvent the wheel or relearn something, or someone else is taking it and using it. So the first thing for me, I tell everybody, is when we talk about, before I get into models and everything else, I'm like, what is your data capture plan? Like, how are you capturing all your data? Right. I had a conversation with a gentleman who's not in medical the other day. He owns an HVAC company here in Las Vegas, and we were kind of talking about that. And he said, "Well, yeah, that makes sense for information-based companies." I go, "No." I said, "You have a business that's derived on humans, correct?" He goes, "Yeah." He said, "You send guys out to fix air conditioners." He said, "Absolutely." He said, we don't have data capture." I'm like, "Sure you do. You have certain models that have the same issues over and over." He goes, "Yeah." He said, "You have certain parts and tools that wear out more." He goes, "Yeah." And I said, "And the bigger one, if you take off the actual products," I said, "you have a guy. Like, everybody's got a guy. Either you got a Jim or a Carlos or whatever, that this is somebody that's been doing this for 25 or 30 years, and they've seen every scenario under the sun. They've got stories of crazy things where they opened up an air conditioner and a family of raccoons were living in it. They know everything about it." And I said, when that person retires or leaves your business, you've lost all of that. You've lost all those experiences. You've lost all that nuance. You've lost all that. And now you have to start over again and create a new Bob, Carlos, or Steve. I said, what if you were able to capture all that, have that where you have an AI twin, and you garnered 25 years worth of business knowledge and nuance and experience, and you can now share that with somebody who's brand new, or somebody that transitioned into leadership. Or if you want to sell the company and you're talking about succession, right? Your company now that is valued 7 figures higher, because you can say, "Hey, you know what? You're not just getting my clientele. I'm giving you 25 years worth of information, and here's how I'm transferring it for you to use it."
Yeah.
So,
Go
I
ahead.
mean, think about that for a medical clinic.
Absolutely. It's funny you say this today, because I was talking to my business partner earlier, and we were talking about how to think about AI and how to think about a firm, a business, right? The traditional business was thought of as a function of its assets, right? The things it owns, potential cash flows, and this intangible element of people, right? And then that was a very accounting centric, a very economic centric approach. And then marketing grew in the 80s and 90s, where we talked about cohorts, and where
Hmm.
the value is your customer base, right? Because your customer base is what's generating the revenue, which
Yep.
drives everything else, right? Um, and so you have, a maturing of the idea of a company, right? It is a function of its customer base plus its people plus
Hmm.
the assets it has like IP, etc. And now, we were talking about, I said, well, ultimately you can think of a firm as a function of all the data that's being generated by the generative process of their endeavor,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely. 100%.
And that's what it is. That's the value. And ultimately, let's say, you're in healthcare, you interact with the outside world, right? And so you're taking those internal assets and trying to deploy them in the real world. And so I take your point. I mean, the true value that AI brings is the ability to vest that knowledge not within our heads or in pieces of paper or in
Yep.
whatever, but to vest it with high fidelity, within an information layer. Uh, but because it's gone multimodal, which you pointed out earlier, that information layer can be video, text, it encompasses everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
absolutely. And I just think if people thought more like that, some of the direction and the questions would be different. Because right now we're using it. To me, I look at it as we're using it like a calculator. We're just punching in numbers and getting out a result. Or, we wanted to record what we say and put it on a piece of paper. Where there's so much more that can be had if people thought about it differently. And part of that is because, in my opinion, as I talk to people in various industries about it, most of them are looking at it to say, okay, here's the way our industry works currently. How do we add AI into it to make it work better? Whereas I would say, why not say, if if I didn't have these previous notions of how my industry worked, and I'm just starting with a blank canvas, how would I do it with AI? How would I do it now knowing I have AI? And it changes the conversation, it changes the direction, it changes the strategy, and it changes the outcomes.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it's in a sense the AI revolution is a function of the advances in compute, the
Yep.
advances in database, the advances in standalone machine learning models, the advances in vision, audio. It's all coming together to create this consciousness, in a sense. It's almost like I did a talk about sporting backgrounds when I look a little bit more athletic. There was always a battle between judo and, like, I don't know, karate, right?
Karate. Yep.
And karate's all about the strikes, right? The strikes, the strikes, the strikes. Whereas judo is like about the way,
Hmm.
right? So it's a principle approach versus a tactical approach. And to your point, a lot of people are thinking about tactically. Whereas if you think of it in a judo way, the judo way is okay, the concept is I'm not going to resist force head on.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter what I do per se, but that's the principle by which whatever I do is driven.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
and I think AI, you to your point, you have to kind of go, no, we're going to use these tools and integrate it into everything we do in the organization, and takes and really kind of have profoundly think about the value we bring. Let's take a step back, because I think we're going very high level, and a lot of times I notice that non-technical people will struggle because they, what does that mean? So if
Mm.
you could perhaps take a case study of something you've done recently where you had to deploy a let's call it a small language model to
Okay.
solve a very particular problem. Could you perhaps sketch out a case study so that we can kind of use that to build these ideas back into place?
Well, one that we have one of our partners is in Poland, um, and we recently they had a project where they wanted to build an app that was based on wellness and weight loss. And so when we were talking about the app, right, one of the things they wanted to build into that was they wanted wearable information to be gathered by the app, right, which is not cutting edge. A lot of apps do that. But when they did that, they wanted then it to be able to give out a specific plan for the customers, right? So the challenge with that obviously is, once again, we get into the identifiable information for the actual patient in order to give them that specific plan, right? Because they're not just giving them, hey, eat, 3 meals a day, have 200 calories a meal. Like, they're actually specking out metabolisms from the wearable data and the information. So it's very highly specific to the patient, right? So when they did that, one of the first things that we originally talked about was saying, okay, listen, you're not going to be able to put this anywhere that can be accessible by anybody else outside of your organization, because there's no way for you to protect it. And they have a, like, if people think HIPAA is stringent here, like, go to Europe and go to Asia. Like, it's different. Like, there's 4 different acts that you have to align with to make sure all the data is working properly, or you go to jail. So with that, they wanted it. They ended up designing uh, a small language model that took everything in, and then over periods of time, it would spit out updates over durations, right? So instead of it doing it when they asked, it would do it over, let's say it was 30 days, 90 days, 180 days, right? As it was getting that information and then spitting that back out. And all that was contained in the small language model. But then they had a larger language model that gave them just general data, so that way they could sparse it out and separate it, but keep out the identifiable information. And it's a really, I mean, it's just such a great app. And the numbers that the people have come back, and we had a meeting about it about 2 months ago, and just some of the results from the patients was just absolutely amazing. And so, interestingly enough, I was at SEC, SE, CES this year in Vegas in January, and I had a conversation with a manufacturer from Asia who had an AI based toilet. And so I'm connecting those two companies because I think they can do something similar for them as they did with the toilet. Because obviously, if the toilet is measuring your markers in urine and blood passed and anything, and stool, anything like that, on a daily basis, you're getting just an amazing amount of information that can be very quickly acted on, or it can actually be more predictive of things coming down the pipe, right? And they're very interested in that small language model, that company did from Poland. So yeah, there's just so many cool things that we can enlist. Once again, it goes to me back about trying to figure out how you're asking the questions. And so that company was they're like, look, and what I loved about it was they brought some similar apps to the table and said, okay, we like this out of this one, we like this out of this one, we like this out of this one, we don't like this, take that away, but then add this. So it was they made it really easy on the strategy part, because they had thought through so many things up front. Um, so yeah, I give kudos to those guys.
No, that's a very cool example, and I think in wound care the problems are similar, right? Like,
Yeah, very.
we have a multifactorial disease state, right? So it's not like, oh, I hurt my toe, right? And it's very particular. Chronic wounds are a function of a global disease state, you
Yeah.
know. And so there's so much data that's driving that disease state, right? And one of the challenges when you do a statistical analysis, is that you're trying to tease out effect, right? Now, in a randomized control trial, super simple, you can control for a bunch of things. Well, it's not, I wouldn't say super simple, but by design, you can control for factors at baseline, right? And so you can tease out the effect. But if you're in the real world, where you have 1,000 things going on,
Yeah.
it's very difficult to measure, right? You're outside of a trial. And so, that kind of idea of collecting data, correlating things together, and then helping to make predictions is obviously helpful in wound care. But I think at one of the conferences, one point I also took away from you is you've got the prediction thing that you want to do, but you also want to handle workflows that are expensive in human time, but cheap in compute time.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Definitely.
yeah, yeah. So
Well,
yeah.
well, let me ask you a quick question, because you just had said something that makes me I was wondering. So when you're doing a trial, right? I know we're getting a little off topic. Sorry. With what's a number of samples that you need to have a trial validated?
So, okay, you got to get going on a tangent, but this is good.
Sorry.
No, this is the part of the podcast to have interesting conversations. So it depends. So a trial you can try to do different things in trials, or in a real world trial, or in a RCT, right? The question is, are you trying to prove causality, right? Where you can say that we had added A and A does this to something, and we're going to measure the difference between these two things. When it comes to adjudicating what sample size you want to use, as statisticians, we do this pretend thing where we say, okay, we know exactly what the effect is going to be. So let's say it's SOC versus treatment A. You go, okay, I believe that treatment A will be 10% better, right? And then you go, okay, how many units or samples do I need to be able to tell that there would be a 10% difference 95% of the time, right? So that you're kind of changing the question by putting a stake in the ground relative to something else and saying, okay, I know there's uncertainty, I know there's randomness, but how many units do I need to, if you're frequentist, to have an error rate of under this amount, or if you're Bayesian, to be able to have a posterior probability, a belief that something is 95% true, right? And then depending on that, you do the math and you come up with your, 50 in each arm or 100 in each arm. It really depends on the question. Now,
Okay.
the challenge is if the difference is very small, right? You need more samples to be able to detect that reliably. If the effect is big, let's say your healing rate in the control is 30%, and your outcome is 60%, you don't need as many units because it's such a big difference that you'll be able to detect it fairly quickly. But if you were at 30% and something was at 33%, you're going to need a massive number of samples to predictably say that. Now, that being said, there's a class of thought in trials that says, why are we doing this weird guessing ahead of time? Take a Bayesian model and do what's called sequential learning, right? So just keep subscribing people to each arm until you can get a good estimate of what that effect is. And you don't know whether the effect is big or small. You're just going to keep collecting information until you either get a very good effect that you can estimate mathematically is valid, or you fail because it's so small that you can't detect anything. And just
Okay.
keep subscribing people until you either fail or win. And then you define beforehand what failure looks like and what winning looks like. So
Interesting.
So to answer your question, that's kind of the two schools of thought around sample size estimation.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, because I had had a conversation, excuse me, with a gentleman, uh, at Human X, which is one of the largest AI conferences on the West Coast, and he's in pharmacology, and so we were talking about the work that some people are talking of doing with AI twins
Hmm.
and trying to utilize them to be able to verify, predict, validate some of these trial findings, and also with new drug discovery.
Yep. Yeah.
And I thought, that's I mean, I can see that's incredibly interesting, but I also wonder, you know, who verifies the AI twins genealogy and data and microbiology to make sure that it's going to be accurate enough to create a drug that's then going to be taken by humans.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work being done, obviously in healthcare, but it's also being done in marketing, where there's a paradigm called, gosh, we're this is great. They're creating what's called agent-based modeling. So
Yep.
you have two approaches, right? You can do a statistical model and get parameters, right? And those parameters create a generative model that generates data, right? Agent-based model says, oh, okay, we'll do it from the ground up, and we're going to create representations of that system, and then we're going to shake them in ways that it looks like in the real world and see what happens,
Mm.
right? Um, the problem with that is it's incredibly expensive relative to building a statistical model. The digital twins are interesting because they kind of meld the two things together, right? They say, hey, we're going to get a parameter and we're going to generate someone who looks like somebody else given the parameters, right? And this person is going to be or thing is going to be indistinguishable from this real person
Hmm.
in terms of the parameters that drive their behavior. So people kind of look at it the other way, but if you can generate the parameters that can generate something that looks like the data, all you need to know is the parameter, and the parameter is going to generate a close enough facsimile of that thing or entity such that they behave like the real thing. And then the test to see if it's true or not is to simulate the fake person and compare the behavior to a facsimile that you've already seen. And as long as they're within a certain bound, they're, for all intents and purposes, basically equal. But then you have to do that for a long time because
Right.
they can look like each other at the start, but then they can
Yeah.
diverge sharply. But if you think about it, and this is the Bayesian in me, we all have paths. Had you not had your health outcome, you would be a different person,
Yep.
right? And so that's where the challenge happens. It's when you get into temporal drift, right?
Yeah.
Because in the real world, we change. So is the model not only able to get me right now, but is
Right.
it able to model the future version of me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which, yeah, that, and yeah, he and I had a fascinating conversation about that because I kind of brought up something similar. And to your point, it's like, okay, so let's say you have me now, but then something that we cannot possibly contemplate happens 3 years from now, right? How are you? Do I come back? Do you reaffirm that information? How are you doing that? So yeah, it was really interesting to kind of go down those rabbit holes and try to figure out where you were coming out at.
But let's and as always, I love talking, but I want to make this about you. And we have about 15, 20 minutes left. The idea of digital twins, I think maybe what might be like really elucidating is, and you talked about this about data collection, and I think implicitly what you were saying is you have these wonderful models that can do wonderful things, but at the end of the day, if you don't feed it data with a good ontology, with good validity, with good processes that can be evaluated. The model cannot fix, upstream issues. So my question for you is, one of the challenges in wound care is we don't have an ontology of wound care, a standardized ontology. Number one.
Yeah.
And number two, we don't have platforms that are very easy to collect data and to then do the validation process of the data. So if you
Yeah.
could just kind of drill down into that, because I think people look at AI over here, but they forget that, to your point, AI is sort of a continuum, a pipeline of different things you have to do.
Yeah. I mean, for a lot of folks, especially when I talk to practitioners and clinicians, many people are using shadow AI. Like they're at work on Claude or GPT, or, they're using, stable diffusion or llama or something else. And so the issue gets to be when, to your point, since there isn't a a one sort of platform, right? To me, I look at it as, if we're all I'm in Vegas and I'm trying to get to LA, right? And I say, hey, Zweli, let's meet here at tomorrow, right? But I don't tell you that there's one main highway that takes you to LA, right? You could go up through the mountains. That's another 7 hours. You could go the wrong direction. You could do a lot of stuff. You could be on a bike, right? I don't know. And so you may make it to that destination where we meet. You may not. And I think a lot of times that's where organizations and people are sort of landing, because you have, right now we have a lot of fear around AI for jobs, and rightfully so. Like, I'm not gonna, these people that get on these podcasts and these tech leaders are like, oh, it's not going to take away jobs. Stop. It is going to take away jobs. It's going to change jobs, and I say that with a precursor of a history buff, because it happened when we went from steam to manufacturing to the information to the internet. It changed the parameters, and so certain jobs went away and other jobs were created and morphed, right? The one difference with AI, though, is outside of those different examples, is even when we switched in many of those cases, you did not have a form of something that was autonomous that could do a job by itself if it was programmed and left to do it. Right? I mean, right now we're getting close to 65% of all coding is now done by computers, whereas if we go back 3 years ago, it was like 12%. So there is definitely going to be some changes, some job change, but I think we need to do get people to understand better what those things are and how to utilize them. And then, to your point, give them the main highways to say, hey, this is what you need to use it for. This is how you need to do it, and standardize that. And I think once you do that, it's going to be much better for everybody, because the reality is we have an implementation problem. The reason that the US was by far ahead in AI, as far as AI dominance in the world 2 years ago, and how we're just a little bit above some places like China, even Singapore. Singapore now has so much in governmental funds and things that they're giving for creation of AI and for AI implementation. And so with us, we don't have that, because we have a handful of companies that are trying to be the king of the hill at the end of the day. Whereas, China's made the move so quickly because almost everything's open source.
Yep.
So you discover something, you share it with me. I then put my stamp on it and go, hey, this is a really great thing you created, Zweli. Why don't I add this to it? Now I share it with someone else. They go, hey, what you two made is great. Let me add this to it. And it advances, versus me trying to silo it so I can control it, i.e. getting paid for it, and we're not just talking about just getting paid. We're talking, king's ransoms. It's holding us all back, right? It's holding everybody back. But to your original question, I think that's where people have to look and say, okay, in my clinic, this is what these are the things that I can absolutely use AI for. I still need to check it and monitor it, but I can take myself out of this, right? I can go and use my human resources and my human intuition for something else. And so those are the real immediate great gains and possibilities. To your point earlier, as you mentioned, as you and I always talk about the dangers, though, right? Because you cannot separate the peril from the possibilities, right? So with that, the peril is if it's not something that you are monitoring or checking on a regular basis, or it's confirmed before it's sent out and you're making it autonomous, right? There's a lot of danger in that. I mean, we now have websites, whether you're using Red Claw or, Open Claw or something else, depending on which claw they're naming it these days. It's been renamed 5 times already. Has a totally, you have programs and AI programs that are just talking to each other, creating their own programs, right? I understand the appeal of that, but for me, the danger of that is really alarming. And to not have a human in the loop in those processes, especially if you're giving controls to have access to other things, other information, phones, any of those things, I think that's incredibly dangerous. And I don't necessarily immediately go to the Terminator scenario of Skynet, but that eventuality is a possibility. It is something, I don't think that's something we can scoff off. And especially when we're talking in healthcare and wound care, those things have to be validated and authenticated because you're talking about somebody's life. I mean, I can imagine if my uncle, had the access to that technology with his diabetes, and then somebody let a program make a decision, didn't check it, didn't authenticate it, didn't verify it, and then he got improper care. So I think those are the things that those discussions have to be had. But I also think at the same time, we have to, I don't care if it's the receptionist, I don't care if it's the nurse, I don't care if it's the doctor, I don't care if it's the scientist, all have to be involved in those conversations together so that they can understand how to best use the tools.
No, absolutely. I use a lot of local AI. Like everyone, I use some of the frontier models, but what I found is AI becomes super powerful when it is seen as integral to process, but it isn't the process. Right? And at the end of the day, to your point, especially in fields which is knowledge driven, which is what medicine is, that's knowledge
Yep.
driven. And knowledge is a function of data and experience
Experience. Yep.
and creativity,
Yep.
right? You can't get rid of experience, right? Data becomes cheap, recall becomes cheap, right? Fusion becomes cheap, and then creativity, right? And I'm not saying when people have creativity, they think of drawing pictures, right? Like, no, creativity is the ability for someone to look at something and to get an insight that is unique,
Yes.
And medicine, despite what the epidemiologists will tell you, right, is N equal 1, right? People make this confusion all the time. They try to apply the general to the particular without realizing that it's the particular,
Yep.
right? And that, the general gives you a base to not be stupid, right? But the particular is where all that creativity and decision making happens. And, you can have the best wound care theory on earth. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the wound care science we have today can deal with 90% of cases,
Yeah.
right? But in those 10% of cases, human creativity, ingenuity, teamwork, coalescence is really what drives things. And so I just think that, AI can help drive us to a certain point, but we must not forget that we're the ones driving the process, not the other way
Yeah,
around. You know,
absolutely.
yeah.
And what I and the other one of my in that same dangers category is, to your point, if you have the information and the science to take care of, let's be generous, let's say 80% of most cases, right? The challenge is, we as humans are always looking for the shortcut, especially here in the USA. So my fear, and I've had this conversation with a number of folks, is that wound care is a specialty. Like it is a specialty that takes a certain, to your point, creativity, a certain amount of experience to be able to be very good at those extreme cases, especially, right? And I just don't want to see, whether it's a hospital system or a practitioner, get to the point that they think that they can take AI to take care of that specialty or any other specialty, right? And all of a sudden you're going to one practitioner, but they're using AI to serve the needs of other specialties. And so that, to me, because we're seeing that in other industries already, that to me is something that you know, I would look at strongly. And the challenge is, which once again, back to the history buff in me, hype travels 5 times faster than governance. So the governance is always going to be super late. And then usually what happens is there's a lot of damage that's done before the governance actually catches up. And so we're in that stage with AI now where the governance is woefully behind. And I'm looking into the near future as, what is that collateral damage that's going to happen to get the governance to speed up?
No, absolutely. I think another element outside of, let's say, clinical areas, and I love the point you made about AIs talking to AIs. If you look at what's happening in reimbursement, right, whether it's the Wiser model, uh, private health insurance companies, they're deploying AI at scale to block, to
Yep,
deny, to
100%.
prior authorizations. So now they have a tool that doesn't sleep, that's allied with people that are very smart to block as much as possible. And I know there'll be denials, but the evidence keeps coming in
Hmm.
that that is true. And the
Yep.
providers are in an asymmetric warfare position, right? You're a military man, right? You have one party that's armed to the teeth with, advanced ballistics, advanced intelligence system, and the other side armed with, oh, I don't know, a bow and arrow and a shovel. And so I think there's this battle, and on the provider side, there has to be an acknowledgement that you need to have tools
Yep.
that not only make your work easier, but also allow you to basically fight a very aggressive reimbursement arena that is using these technologies against you. I hate to say
Yeah.
it, but the evidence keeps coming in, and it generally goes only in one direction. you know,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
so I think from a provider perspective, I think we need to, provider groups, people who work in practice management have to think deeply about the tools to fight those battles. Um, and, on the regulatory side as well, a lot of the regulatory work, let's say nursing homes, et cetera, is being performed using AI.
Yeah.
And so now again, you have an issue where you could talk to a human and talk about n equals one. And there's nuance, there's subtlety. And the person from a clinical perspective may say, okay, on average, this would be a problem. But given the data you've given me, I understand how this worked, ergo, we'll make reasonable decisions. But
Hmm.
if you have an AI that is trained by someone to be incredibly one dimensional, it becomes very disruptive. you know. And so I just that's my fear on the regulatory side. That's my fear on the reimbursement side. Oh, and by the way, and we talked about this at the last conference, just straight stealing,
Yeah,
right? Like,
100%.
people. I said this at the conference. I'll say it here. When you're using Claude, Gemini, whoever it is, you in your prompting are giving an insight into your mind, your
Hmm.
ideas. If it's your business, your literal business model, and you have no idea what happens after they deliver you the response to your prompt,
Hmm.
right? Now, Anthropic says we'll keep it for 30 days and then we'll delete it. But in those 30 days, they get to generate a digital twin
Yeah.
of your thoughts and your business. And I think it was Alex Karp last week who said Anthropic, Gemini, etc. Are, are, if you're not thinking they're going to steal your business model, if you have anything valuable or valuable enough, you're out of your mind. you
Well, I
know.
mean, I think I sent you the post. I posted a couple weeks ago. The whole thing is theft. I mean, it's just the entire industry is built on theft. It's nobody has been paid any royalties. Nobody has been paid for their thoughts. This has just been aggregation. And so, the only industry that's really been mounting a, I guess you would call it a consensus of fight back has been the acting, is film
Mhm.
industry. Everybody else has, kind of said a few things here or there, but I haven't seen anybody else that's really said, "Hey, hold on a second, like we need to get paid for this. You guys are taking our images, you're taking our words, you're taking all these other things." So it just amazes me how easily we've all been pacified by the access to the information to not say, wait a minute, what about all these wonderful works of art? What about all this data that's been aggregated by hardworking scientists who spent 20 or 30 years to get this information that now you can have in a split second, but you're charging, 20 or $30 a month or whatever you're charging, or if you're tokenized and you're charging me tokens based on getting the information, but yet you did not come up with that information.
Yeah. We saw it coming with the music industry.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the
absolutely.
greatest example of just utter theft. And again, I don't mean to be negative, but I think we have to have serious conversations about IP and who owns what. And if I'm using your tool and you set up something to compete against me using literally my data and my thoughts, is that ethical? Is
Yeah,
that
no,
moral?
well, to your point, like, I mean, I've lived this already because when we talked about me being in the military, but when I got out of the military, I was in the music industry for 5 years. So I was on the International Music Managers Forum. I was actually at some of those meetings when they were having trials against Napster.
Hmm.
So I remember all of that, and this is the exact same except worse because you didn't have to have, everybody already has a computer, everybody's already online, whereas back then, right, they Apple hadn't was just coming out with their product, so you didn't still didn't have the mechanism, wasn't as easy to steal the music, right? And so many people were just getting computers, were just getting online, so it wasn't as pervasive. Now, I mean, you have third and fourth graders who have their own phone, who get online or have their own iPads, and it's so pervasive. So yeah, we just let the wolf come in and sleep right next to us in the house of sheep.
Well, in a sense, it's far worse too, because it's one thing to use the analogy of music. It's one thing to steal the song after I've released it,
Hmm.
MP3 it, share it, right? It's quite another to be in the studio with me, watch me put together the notes, look into my notebook, watch every second of how I strum the guitar, pay attention to what my producer's doing. Literally, that is like infinitely worse because, okay, you steal a song, I'm not happy about it, but I can create a new one, and you have no
Yeah.
idea how I can create a new one. These tools, if not careful, they can literally steal the whole ability to create music.
Yep.
You know, which is kind of, it's cool if you can do it, not so cool if someone else can do it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
But
I mean, we're in some strange times.
yeah, no, I think, I would love to continue these conversations because I think, we've been doing these podcasts and especially in these areas like AI or real world evidence, we're finding that one episode's not enough. We're just barely scratching the surface of some very highly technical and interesting subjects. And so I'll make the request on this episode, put you on the spot a little bit, but we'd love to have you back. I'd love to, talk about very specific areas of AI because at the last SOC, it was the number one thing that everyone was talking about. And I think your experience, your knowledge, would just be incredibly valuable for the rest of the wound care community to really kind of drill down on this because I think 1 hour does not do it justice.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Sean. I appreciate it. We've been at it for about 1 hour and 6 minutes, and I want to be respectful of your time. But I'd like to thank you. The one question we ask, I almost forgot, is if you had infinite time, infinite resources over the next year, what is the one problem in wound care that you would attempt to solve?
That's a really good question. I would think, for me, I go back to my own experience, and I'm always leaning toward predictive, right? So for me, I would want to solve, how do I have something, a tool, a format, something that allows me, or I should say, allows practitioners to predict what is going to happen to their patients before it happens versus being reactive, so that way they catch them early enough that they can make substantive changes to not have the event happen altogether. Like if I can make anything happen, that's what I would want to see.
That's a that's a great response. We might be working on something along those lines. We might be
Nice.
working on it.
That's great.
It's a seminal question, and that's a great response. Well, Sean, such a pleasure. Definitely want to welcome you back to the podcast, and I think the audience would concur with me that your insight has just been fantastic. And apart from the radio voice, which is showing me up on my own show, I'm very thankful for your time and look forward to speaking to you next time.
You as well, my friend. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
All right, then. Cheers.